It's strange how disrespect rarely enters a room with noise or chaos. Instead, it often slips in quietly, dressed in small gestures that most people overlook. That dinner was supposed to be a simple gathering, nothing extravagant, nothing dramatic, just a chance to sit together, share a meal, and enjoy a peaceful evening. At least, that's what I thought. I walked in with the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing you've done nothing wrong and expecting, at the very least, the courtesy that any normal gathering should offer. But the moment I stepped inside, the air felt different. Not hostile, not openly rude, but heavy in a way that made me pause for a second, as if my presence wasn't entirely welcome. It was the kind of heaviness that often hides behind forced smiles and polite greetings that don't reach the eyes. The subtle disrespect began before I even sat down. It was in the way their eyes flicked at me, too quickly, too dismissively. It was in the half-hearted hello, the kind that feels more like a reflex than genuine acknowledgement. It was in the way someone continued scrolling through their phone as I walked in, not even bothering to look up. These were tiny moments, technically harmless, but together they created a quiet message that was loud enough for me to hear. I wasn't equal at that table. I wasn't valued. I wasn't considered someone worth making room for in the atmosphere they had prepared for themselves. When I moved toward the table, the real signals began to show themselves. My seat, the one I'd naturally choose, the one closest to the host, the one everyone else knew I preferred, had been taken. Not casually, not accidentally, but purposefully, as if someone had planned it beforehand. And the person sitting there didn't even pretend to offer it back. They just smiled, that little smile people use when they want you to know they've done something and they're daring you to react. I felt a small shock go through me, not because the seat mattered, chairs are chairs, but because of what it represented. Seating is symbolic. It tells you where others believe you stand in their world. And that night, their symbolism was loud. The next wave of disrespect came through the conversations happening around the table. It was subtle, almost artful in the way it was delivered. Whenever I tried to join in, someone would talk over me. Whenever I tried to respond, someone else shifted the topic. It wasn't open exclusion, that would have been too obvious. It was the quieter, more poisonous kind, the kind that looks like normal conversation from the outside but feels like a deliberate freezing out from inside. A few people exchanged glances when I spoke, the kind of glances that carry annoyance or ridicule. One person even smirked as if my words didn't carry weight. And the strangest part was that no one else noticed, or maybe they did and pretended not to, which is sometimes even worse. It wasn't long before the atmosphere clarified itself. I wasn't just being ignored, I was being evaluated, judged, and silently pushed aside. The hospitality everyone else received, the warm tone, the questions about their day, the polite nods, never reached me. Instead, I got clipped replies, lukewarm smiles, and an overall sense that my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Even the way they placed the dishes on the table felt different. Plates were offered across me instead of to me. Someone handed you. The disrespect was everywhere, woven into the smallest details. The host asked everyone else for their drink preferences but didn't bother asking me. When I finally mentioned what I'd like, it was met with a delayed response, like my request had interrupted something important. My glass stayed empty longer than anyone else's. My plate was served last. Nobody noticed, or pretended not to, that my chair was slightly off from the rest, not properly placed at the table. These were things that individually mean nothing, but when they all happen together, in the same room, on the same night, they form a pattern that's impossible to ignore. But what struck me the most were the expressions, tiny, fleeting expressions on their faces that appeared for a fraction of a second before disappearing behind polite masks. A raised eyebrow. A subtle smirk. A tightened lip. A knowing glance exchanged between two people who thought I couldn't see. These were the real indicators, the real truth behind the surface-level politeness they tried to maintain. People always reveal themselves in these micro-moments, and if you pay close enough attention, you can hear exactly what they're saying without a single word spoken. I sat there quietly, observing everything, feeling each tiny disrespect land like the soft tap of a finger on a drum. Not loud enough to cause a scene, but steady enough to create a rhythm you can't ignore. And as I watched them move around the table, laughing freely with each other while barely acknowledging me, I felt something shifting inside me, not anger, not bitterness, but clarity. The clarity that comes when people show you exactly who they are. The clarity that whispers that something deeper is happening beneath the surface. The clarity that tells you this night, this dinner, this subtle mistreatment is not a coincidence, but a choice they're making together. The moment the humiliation became impossible to ignore didn't arrive with shouting or insults. It came disguised as something ordinary, something so small that if I had been less attentive, I might have brushed it aside as a harmless slip. But humiliation has a way of making itself known, not through volume, but precision. It strikes in the exact place where your dignity sits, tapping it again and again until you realize the tap isn't accidental at all. That night, sitting at that table, surrounded by people who pretended to be warm and welcoming, I felt a shift, a sharp, undeniable shift, when their disrespect stopped being subtle and finally stepped into the open. It began when the first dish arrived. The host carried it over with a smile so polished it almost gleamed, and for a moment I thought maybe I had misread the earlier moments. Maybe the awkwardness at the door, the odd glances, the half-hearted greetings were all in my head. But then the plate was placed in front of everyone except me. Not one person. Not two. Every single person received their portion while my space remained empty, my plate cold and untouched. I waited politely, assuming they would realize the oversight. I even gave them the benefit of the doubt, thinking perhaps they were serving in a certain order. Yet minutes passed, and nothing changed. My plate sat barren while conversations continued around me as if everything was perfectly normal. What made it worse wasn't the missing food. It was the way they behaved, as though I wasn't sitting right there, as though I had somehow become invisible in my own seat. And then came the comment, the one that shifted the tone of the entire evening. Someone said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Maybe we don't need to waste a full portion on someone who barely contributes anyway." The words were coded in a laugh, the kind of laugh meant to soften the cruelty inside them, but it didn't soften anything. Every person at that table heard the intention. I felt the sting immediately, sharp and intimate. For a second, it was difficult to tell what shocked me more, the remark itself, or the silence that followed. Not one person spoke up. Not one person questioned it. The host gave a tight smile, as if amused. Someone else down the table snickered, trying to hide it behind their napkin. They had turned me into the joke of the night, an object presented for their amusement, and they assumed I would just sit there and accept it. The next moment pushed the humiliation even further. When the second dish arrived, I received a portion so small it looked like a sample, not a serving. A spoonful at best. A gesture so intentionally disrespectful that it was impossible to sugarcoat. Someone laughed openly this time, and another added, "It suits them. They don't need more than that." Their voices weren't hushed anymore. They weren't pretending. The subtlety was gone entirely, replaced by a casual cruelty delivered as though it were perfectly normal. As though I should thank them for it. I looked around and saw the truth reflected in their expressions. Some people were entertained. Some were indifferent. A few were uncomfortable but stayed silent to protect themselves. And in that silence, I learned everything I needed to know about what they really thought of me. These weren't accidental gestures or clumsy social mistakes. This was a group decision, a collective choice to make me the easy target of the night. They weren't laughing with me. They were laughing at me, and they didn't care how clearly I could see it. Then came the moment that sealed it beyond any doubt. Someone asked the host if there were more drinks available. The host nodded, rose from their seat, and began pouring glasses one by one again, skipping mine entirely. Not a glance. Not a question. Not even a fake apology this time. When I finally asked, calmly and politely, "May I have one as well?" the host didn't meet my eyes. They simply said, "Oh, I didn't think you needed one," and moved on. The entire table fell into that awkward kind of silence, the silence that pretends to be innocent but is soaked in judgment. That was the moment. Not the missing food. Not the snide remarks. Not the empty glass. It was the look in their eyes after the host dismissed me. That look told me everything: the amusement, the superiority, the satisfaction of knowing they had pushed me down a notch and believed I wouldn't have the strength to push back. It wasn't just disrespect anymore. It was intentional humiliation, laid out like a performance they all silently agreed to attend. When I spoke, no one listened. When I reached for something, hands moved things slightly out of the way. When I tried to join in a conversation, someone else interrupted deliberately and redirected the topic as if my words didn't hold weight. It was a systematic stripping away of my presence, of my value, of my right to be treated like a human being at a dinner table. And through it all, they expected me to stay quiet, to pretend it didn't bother me, to play the role they had assigned without protest. In that moment, sitting in the middle of a table full of people who believed their humiliation was powerful enough to diminish me, I felt something sharper than anger rising inside me. A cold clarity. A silent understanding. A shift that told me exactly what needed to be done next, and exactly how deeply they had underestimated me. The decision not to react didn't happen in a burst of emotion or a dramatic surge of anger. It happened slowly, quietly, right in the middle of that table where every stare, every smirk, and every disguised insult was carefully being served alongside the food. As they laughed, exchanged glances, and continued their performance of superiority, a strange stillness began to form inside me. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't defeat. It was something far more controlled, like tightening the strings of a bow before releasing an arrow. They thought I was sitting there in silence because I had no strength to respond, but the truth was that silence is a powerful weapon when you choose it intentionally. I felt every moment they tried to push me into a reaction. Every whisper that wasn't quiet enough. Every sarcastic laugh. Every tiny attempt to provoke me into defending myself so they could twist the narrative and pretend I was the problem. They were waiting for me to snap, waiting for me to raise my voice, waiting for me to show them vulnerability they could reshape into guilt or blame. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted their humiliation to end with my embarrassment. But I refused to give them that satisfaction. Not because I couldn't speak, but because I realized something more valuable: reacting emotionally would only feed the very people who wanted to see me break. So I chose not to respond. Not in that moment. Not in the way they expected. Instead, I began to observe with the kind of clarity that only comes when you sit still enough to see through masks. I watched the way they leaned toward each other when they whispered. I watched who avoided my gaze and who looked too long. I watched who laughed the hardest at the smallest jabs. These observations were more revealing than any outburst could have been. Their behavior was telling me everything: who the instigators were, who the followers were, who pretended neutrality just to stay safe, and who silently enjoyed the D. There's a unique power in letting people show you who they truly are. One by one, their true personalities surfaced through their careless confidence. They mistook my silence for surrender. They thought my calm expression meant I wasn't affected. But inside, I was gathering everything: each insult, each disrespect, each moment they tried to diminish me. Not to hold on to bitterness, but to prepare something stronger, something purposeful. Revenge isn't born from impulsive anger, it's shaped from controlled understanding. And in that moment, I understood them with a level of clarity they never expected. As the dinner continued, I leaned back slightly and let the noise of their chatter swirl around me. I listened more than I spoke. I watched more than I participated. And in that quiet space within myself, I made a decision: not to lash out, not to confront them in the middle of their petty performance, but to wait. To choose the right moment. To strike where it would matter. Because reacting immediately would only give them a sense of victory, something they had been craving from the moment I walked through the door. They wanted to see me lose control. They wanted to watch me crumble. They wanted proof that their efforts had worked. And when I didn't react, I saw something flicker across their faces: confusion. Confusion turned to annoyance. Annoyance edged into frustration. They tried harder. One comment became sharper. Another joke became more pointed. Someone even asked in a mock concerned tone if I was feeling left out, pretending to care while clearly hoping I'd break. But my silence acted like a mirror, reflecting their own insecurity back at them. They didn't understand why their behavior wasn't affecting me the way they intended. They didn't understand why I wasn't rising to the bait. They didn't understand how someone could sit through such a coordinated attack and still maintain composure. Their confusion became my power. The more they tried, the more obvious their intentions became, not just to me, but to anyone at the table who still had a functioning sense of decency. I noticed the subtle shifts: the person who looked down at their plate after each insult, uncomfortable with what was unfolding; the one who forced a laugh but never quite joined in fully; the one whose smile faded just slightly when they realized the cruelty was no longer disguised. My silence wasn't just exposing them to me, it was exposing them to each other. As I sat there, watching, listening, absorbing every detail, a different kind of realization surfaced. People who rely on mockery for power are fragile. They thrive only when they believe they've cornered you. When they believe you're defenseless. When they believe you'll crumble under the pressure they apply. But remove the reaction they depend on, and they are left standing in their own emptiness, holding insults that have nowhere to land. And that's when you see their real weakness, their dependence on your response. I decided, in that quiet clarity, that my revenge would not be rushed. It would not be loud. It would not come in the form of a confrontation that allowed them to twist the narrative. It would come from patience. From strategy. From timing. And most importantly, from allowing them to continue underestimating me. People who underestimate you give you more power than people who fear you. They become predictable, careless, overconfident. They reveal their vulnerabilities without even realizing it. And that's exactly what they were doing, moment by moment, sentence by sentence. Every second I stayed silent, my plan sharpened itself. Not with anger, but with precision. Not with spite, but with structure. They thought they were in control of the night, but my silence was turning their performance into a blueprint, a detailed map of exactly where to strike later. And so I sat there, calm, quiet, steady, letting them believe that their cruelty had left me powerless, while inside, something far more powerful was taking shape, something they would never be prepared for. The turning point didn't arrive with a sudden explosion. It unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, in the tiny cracks of their confidence. They were so sure of themselves that night, so convinced they were untouchable, so certain they controlled the tone of the evening, that they didn't notice how their own arrogance was beginning to work against them. At first, their mockery came in carefully disguised forms, delivered with half-smiles or wrapped in jokes they could deny later if confronted. But as time passed and they mistook my silence for weakness, their caution began to disappear. They forgot to hide the cruelty. They forgot to soften the aggression. They forgot to pretend they were decent. That was when things began to shift, not because I said anything, but because their behavior became louder than any words I could have spoken. Their confidence grew reckless. Their comments became sharper, less coded. Their laughter took on a different tone, not the light laughter of people enjoying a meal, but the hard-edged laughter of people who believe they are safe enough to drop the mask. And when people feel too safe, they show their true selves without realizing it. It started with a moment so small that none of them realized its significance. Someone asked the host a simple question about the evening plans, a question they thought would go unnoticed. But the answer was the first slip, too honest, too revealing. The host said, "Well, we didn't expect everyone to show up anyway," and their eyes flicked toward me in a way that betrayed the truth. They hadn't wanted me there. They hadn't invited me out of warmth or respect. They had included me because someone else insisted, or because appearances needed to be kept, or because excluding me directly would have made them look bad. And now, caught in the comfort of their own arrogance, they revealed more than they intended. The table quieted for a moment, not fully silent, just a brief hesitation that felt like the room inhaling. I noticed it. A few others noticed it too. But none of them were brave enough to acknowledge it. They brushed it aside, pretending nothing uncomfortable had slipped through. Yet something had. And once something cracks, it doesn't take much for the rest of the truth to spill out. As the dinner continued, the dynamic shifted further. Someone told a story meant to embarrass a person not present. Their voice carried a little too much pleasure. Their smile lingered too long on the edge of insult. The rest of the table laughed, but the laughter didn't sound natural anymore. It sounded forced, encouraged, almost desperate, like they were performing for each other. And in that moment, I understood that their cruelty didn't come from strength, it came from insecurity. They weren't united by confidence. They were united by fear of being the next target. That was why they played along so eagerly. That was why they needed to humiliate someone else. It kept them safe from scrutiny. But as they grew careless, they also began to contradict themselves. One person joked about how everyone here is equal, moments after intentionally excluding me from a conversation. Another mentioned how we all respect each other, right after someone else had made a comment that was anything but respectful. Their hypocrisy became obvious, not just to me but to anyone paying attention. And the more they tried to assert their dominance, the more they began exposing the cracks in their unity. The turning point wasn't a single comment or action. It was a series of small unravelings. A moment when two of them whispered about something they didn't want the others to hear. A strange tension in the air when someone's joke pushed a little too far and landed on the wrong person. A sudden silence when one of them realized they had revealed something they intended to keep hidden. All of these moments were small, but together, they formed a clear picture. They were losing control of the narrative they had constructed. Their confidence began to look like overcompensation. Their laughter became jittery. Their jokes lacked rhythm. The table felt uneven, as if the balance they had tried to maintain was beginning to tilt. I watched it all quietly, taking in every gesture, every hesitant look, every slip of truth that escaped through careless words. The very people who believed they were orchestrating the evening were now unraveling their own performance without realizing it. And then something happened that solidified everything. One of them made a comment, this time directed at someone else completely, and it hit harder than anyone expected. The person targeted didn't laugh. They didn't even fake it. Their eyes darkened just slightly, and they shifted back in their chair with a stiffness that didn't go unnoticed. A ripple went through the table, soft but unmistakable. The group sensed it. Someone had gone too far. Someone had cracked the surface they all stood on. For a moment, the room felt different. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about them. Their alliances were fragile. Their confidence was conditional. And they were beginning to turn on one another without meaning to. People who thrive on humiliation eventually lose control of their cruelty. It spills outward, touching anyone nearby, even their own. And when that happens, the foundation begins to crumble. Their interactions changed after that moment. Mistrust entered the room, subtle but present. They watched each other differently. They laughed a little too loudly to cover discomfort. They shifted in their seats more often, unable to settle. Their earlier confidence, the confidence that had fueled their disrespect, was slipping, piece by piece. They had no idea that this slow collapse, this quiet unraveling of their unity, was exactly what I needed. They were too absorbed in maintaining their own image to notice the ground beneath them shifting. They didn't see the discomfort growing in their eyes, or the tension tightening their jaws, or the insecurity creeping into their smiles. They didn't notice the exact moment their confidence began to turn into carelessness, or how that carelessness was setting the stage for everything that would come next. All they saw was someone sitting quietly, saying nothing, reacting to nothing, giving them no hint of the storm silently forming in the spaces they had left wide open. The setup of my revenge didn't begin with a dramatic announcement or some obvious shift in my behavior. It began quietly, almost invisibly, beneath the surface of their confidence. While they were busy enjoying the sound of their own laughter and the taste of their own arrogance, I was busy studying the room, not just the people, but the dynamics, the power lines, the unspoken tensions that had begun forming between them. Revenge, when done right, isn't a sudden act. It's a slow, precise gathering of details, a patient weaving of threads that eventually tighten around the people who thought they held all the strings. And that night, the threads were practically placing themselves in my hands. I realized something important as I watched them crumble under the weight of their own carelessness. People who humiliate others do so because they believe they are untouchable. They believe no one sees their weaknesses. They believe no one is paying attention. But I was paying attention to everything. Every slip. Every inconsistency. Every crack in their unity. They didn't realize it, but they were giving me all the material I needed, all the leverage they thought they had against me, except they were handing it over without even noticing. I began by shifting my role in the room, not fully withdrawing, but becoming quietly observant. When someone spoke, I watched how others reacted. When someone laughed, I watched who joined in sincerely and who forced their smile. I noticed who tried too hard to lead the conversation, and who seemed irritated when the attention wasn't on them. I noticed the small rivalries that existed long before I entered TH. My silence was my greatest tool. It made them underestimate me even more. It made them think I was shrinking while truthfully, I was expanding my understanding of each of them. They never noticed how deliberate my quietness was. They thought they had cornered me. They thought I was powerless. They thought their behavior had pushed me into a corner where I had no choice but to accept their treatment. And that false sense of victory made them sloppy. They talked too freely. They revealed too much. Some spoke carelessly about others at the table, forgetting who was within earshot. Some bragged about things they should have kept private. Some exaggerated stories to make themselves look better, not realizing how transparent they sounded. And with every careless word, they handed me more to work with. My revenge wouldn't come from anger, it would come from precision. So I listened, absorbing their stories like data points. I watched them contradict themselves, contradict each other, and contradict the image they tried so desperately to maintain. The more they tried to display confidence, the more their insecurities leaked through. And I took note of every insecurity, every point of pride, every fear disguised as confidence, because revenge is most effective when it lands exactly where it hurts the most. Then came the next layer of my setup, letting them believe they were in control. I nodded occasionally, smiled politely when appropriate, never challenging, never pushing back. This convinced them even further that I was harmless. They didn't realize that their need to dominate the room was revealing exactly how much control they lacked. People who truly hold power don't need to announce it. The ones who scream for it are usually the most fragile. And fragility is easy to break once you know where the surface is thinnest. As the evening progressed, I subtly began to influence the flow of the conversation, not by speaking loudly, but by placing small, deliberate questions that exposed their inconsistencies. A simple, innocent-sounding question here. A casual comment there. And just like that, two of them contradicted each other. One revealed a lie the other had told earlier. Another exposed their own insecurity while trying to hide it behind sarcasm. No one noticed that these moments were connected. They thought these were natural slips. They didn't realize I was nudging them gently, guiding the cracks to widen. I wasn't sabotaging them yet. I was simply giving them room to sabotage themselves. At one point, someone made a careless remark that unintentionally insulted another person at the table. Normally, in a setting where everyone feels secure, this would have sparked quick laughter or light banter. But because the group had already become unsettled, because the balance of confidence had shifted without them understanding why, the remark landed differently. I watched their faces closely. The person who was insulted froze for a second. Their eyes narrowed just slightly. A few others exchanged uncertain glances. And in that moment of tension, I simply sat back and quietly observed, allowing the discomfort to spread without interruption. Their earlier mockery of me had made them careless, but now that carelessness was turning inward. They were starting to snap at each other. Small, passive-aggressive comments slipped through. Someone corrected another a little too sharply. Someone else rolled their eyes when they thought no one saw. But I saw everything. Every growing tension. Every emerging fracture. They had been so focused on pushing me down the social ladder that they didn't notice they were losing their footing on their own. That was the moment I realized how perfectly the setup was unfolding. I didn't need to attack them. I just needed to let them unravel, let their own words and actions become the foundations of my revenge. And as they continued to underestimate me, as they continued to disrespect me without caution, they kept digging themselves deeper into the trap they didn't know I had already begun constructing around them. All I had to do was wait, keep listening, keep observing, keep gathering every detail they carelessly spilled into the room because their arrogance blinded them to their own vulnerabilities. There's a moment in every revenge story where the balance finally shifts, where the person who has been underestimated for far too long silently decides, enough is enough. For me, that moment didn't arrive with noise or drama, it arrived quietly, right in the middle of the mess they had created for me, as I stood there realizing that the people who were smiling at my discomfort were doing so because they believed I had no power left to fight back. It was almost amusing, in a dark sort of way, how confidently they assumed I would just accept the humiliation, swallow it whole, and carry on as if nothing had happened. What they didn't know was that the very moment they pushed me too far, they unlocked a side of me they had never expected to meet, a side that didn't break under pressure but sharpened because of it. I remember looking around the room, observing faces that pretended innocence but carried the unmistakable glint of satisfaction, as if ruining my evening was some kind of entertainment for them. People like them always convince themselves that their behavior is harmless, or justified, or even funny, but deep down, their actions always reveal more about their own insecurities than anything else. Standing there, with the sting of their disrespect still burning under my skin, I felt a clarity that I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the clarity of someone who finally decides not to absorb another insult, not to remain silent to keep the peace, and not to let anyone dictate where they stand in a room filled with people who think they can walk over them. That clarity didn't roar, it whispered. And in that whisper was the beginning of my revenge. I didn't need anger to fuel me, disappointment alone was powerful enough. I didn't need a dramatic confrontation, patience was going to serve me far better. I didn't need to expose their pettiness in front of everyone, all I needed was to let their actions guide them straight into the consequences they had unknowingly prepared for themselves. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't loud or explosive, it's strategic, almost elegant, the kind that mirrors their disrespect with precision and makes them realize what they've done without you ever having to raise your voice. As I stood there, I felt myself detaching from their noise, their judgment, their smug looks. I observed them calmly, almost as if I were studying characters in a story I had long outgrown. People who behave like they did always mistake kindness for weakness, mistaking silence for surrender, never realizing that silent people often notice everything, every slight, every smirk, every whispered insult. And while they are busy believing they've won, the silent ones are mapping every detail, preparing something far more impactful than an immediate reaction. In that moment, I realized that revenge doesn't always come from a place of hatred. Sometimes it comes from a place of balance, restoring what was taken, respect, dignity, control, by turning their behavior back onto them in a way they never saw coming. I wasn't seeking to hurt anyone unnecessarily, I was simply preparing to return the lesson they had so confidently handed to me. And the beauty of this kind of revenge is that it doesn't require cruelty, it only requires timing, awareness, and the subtle art of letting people trap themselves with their own choices. As they continued talking among themselves, oblivious to the shift happening inside me, I could almost predict exactly how the rest of the night would unfold for them without them ever suspecting my part in it. Their arrogance was a roadmap, their assumptions were clues, their lack of self-awareness was the perfect stage for what was coming. I didn't need to fabricate anything or force a single moment, they had already given me everything required to turn the evening around in my favor. The only thing left for me to do was wait, watching the scene unfold like summio. I reminded myself that the best revenge is never rushed. It lingers. It waits for the right moment, the right audience, the right opportunity to reveal itself. And standing in that room, surrounded by people who had mistaken my silence for defeat, I knew the opportunity would present itself naturally. It always does, because disrespectful people eventually expose themselves without any help. All I had to do was be ready, and I was more than ready. The calm settling inside me wasn't weakness, it was preparation, the quiet before a shift they wouldn't see coming until it was far too late. What they didn't know was that the version of me they were disrespecting wasn't the one they would face next. They had triggered a transformation without realizing it, giving me the push I didn't know I needed, awakening a part of me that didn't panic under pressure but thrived on clarity. And once that part of me was awake, there was no going back. The disaster they created had already begun to reshape itself into something entirely different, something that would ultimately remind them why underestimating someone can be the most dangerous mistake of all.